So here's how we have this thought of. This is a panel at first for you guys just to briefly reflect on what you've heard from others and what that's prompted you to think about or wonder about or puzzle through. And then after a little bit of that, we'll open the floor for questions and carry that on for a while, and then we'll stop and we'll have a reception and then party. So how about if I start in the order in which we did it? So I'll ask Marc first, and then Carol, and then Dan. Mm-hmm. So Marc, just if you could start us off with a few reflections.
Right.
On
Yeah. So I could say something about something perhaps I didn't insist enough in my own talk, and which connects with the two other talks, which is that subjective well-being data can be used in different ways, and we should be careful not to disparage them when they are not good for one particular use. They could be actually good in other uses, and so in my talk I was especially focusing on the idea that is being defended by some colleagues, that you can use the raw scores of subjective well-being and somehow put them in your social objective function, social welfare function, as the economists put it, and that gives you somehow directly a measure of people's utility or well-being without any need for correction. But that's only one possible use. So the criticism I made was about warning against this possible use because of the difficulties of comparing across people and so on. But there are other uses I didn't mention much, so I was very glad that Carol did bring this idea of using the association between subjective well-being and conditions to understand something about what matters to people and how their life can be analyzed. And so in that different sort of use, subjective well-being data can serve two purposes. One is to try to understand the relative importance of different objective dimensions, like having a job, or being in good health, or being married versus divorced versus widowed, and so on. And so that can give us an idea of this relative importance of these things for people, and something different that is less usual, but I think Carol did bring it to the fore, is use them as sort of advanced indicator for things going on, especially when things go to the extreme, when people suffer shocks that may not be very well recorded by other data. Perhaps these data can help us. So there are these sort of uses that can be useful, even though they cannot be just used in as something like gross national happiness that replaces GDP in a very simple way. And one question I wanted to ask my two colleagues is, and connecting to the issue of trade-offs, is that I myself practiced a little bit. I'm not so much an empirical person, but with colleagues, we've been looking at how to use subjective well-being data to make estimations of people's preferences that we could then use for the construction of other indicators like equivalent income and this sort of thing, right? So somehow you estimate people's indifference curves on the basis of these regressions of satisfaction over objective conditions. And we meet a lot of skepticism from other econometricians saying, but you have a lot of endogeneity problems with this kind of regression. You have a lot of missing data, unobservable variables, and so on. So what is not clear to me is how much progress we can make with this data toward better understanding the way people make trade-offs, and how we should reform the data collection with better questions or better ways. I mean, for instance, panel data are a little less bad than cross-section data, so it's good if you can follow people over time. Are there other methods? Should we combine these data with stated preference questions where people are asked directly about the trade-offs they would be willing to make? And there are different methods to ask stated preference questions. You can just ask about people's situation and ask them if they would accept to change their situation have a little more of this or a little less of that. That's one approach. And you have things which are more like you show people random selections of vignettes. You say, this is a situation you could have, this is another situation, and so on. And people are asked to rank these options. So there are different methods like that. And so, and we could also try to combine with all of that revealed preference data. And I know that there is a survey that's being done in Belgium where they try to somehow do a triangulation of people's trade-offs by using all these data at the same time on the same survey. But so yeah, I'd be happy to hear more from my colleagues about how they think, how we can make progress toward better understanding how people make trade-off and what matters to them, what's the relative importance of dimensions of life.
Thank you. Maybe I'll have each of you answer that question.
Okay, well, before answering that, I actually had some observations from both other presentations that I think triggered my thinking in a very constructive way. So, Marc, both really interesting to listen to you in terms of ranking the measures according to kind of different characteristics and where the subjective measures fit in. And I think we very much agree on both of those things. Maybe to reiterate a point I made, I think reacting to you in my talk earlier, was that not for seeking the one big perfect measure, but if you're using a dashboard of measures, that it's actually the more interesting story and the more useful to measure is when you get these inconsistencies, say, between what income and subjective well-being predict. I mean, the skeptic's conclusion is, well, the subjective data is all noise, but the other interpretation is, well, there are things that matter to people's, perceived well-being that, objective measures don't pick up, and you obviously there's error in both, and I think that's in that area where the measures tell different things, that it at least opens a door for exploring whatever paradoxes come out. And then on the I totally agree with you about warning about interpersonal comparisons and just throwing those into some other measure. It just seems so obvious that, when you compare person A and person B, because of the, adaptation problem and everything else, that it can be very biased, but then the kind of the large N story and the patterns that are robust across so many people, I think, can be useful in lots of ways. Before trying to answer your question, one other warning is that there are indeed a lot of people that kind of want to plug subjective well-being measures of all kinds into some concept that will measure, it will be sort of gross national happiness or some other sort of progress assessment. And one, I think it's a biased exercise that's full of problems, but two, I think going back to the point about this is something that can be so easily manipulated. I mean, all data can be manipulated by bad politicians, but having well-being or happiness as a policy objective, when, I think we're making great strides and really interesting progress in defining these concepts better and everything else, but in the public mind, it's just an open door for, bad politicians to do really dumb and manipulative things. Secondly, I think where we could make much more progress once we start to use the metrics, say, as the Brits do, and they're reported, the first year they were reported, people didn't know what was up and what was down. Now, what the hell does this mean? But over time, people get used to the numbers and the scales and they start to mean something. So let me give you an example. If you think about, if you hear that the unemployment rate went up by 1% last month, that's a bad thing. If you hear that it went up by 0.1%, you think, well, so what? No, the average Joe has no idea what numbers of people you're talking about. You're talking about a percentage of the unemployed population, so it's a pretty small number. And yet everybody sees, oh, it went up by 1%, oh, that's awful. Went up by 0.1%, oh, doesn't matter. That's just because people have gotten used to the scale and the numbers, and they've heard it enough times to know what's kind of a meaningful change and what's not. And so I think if I were to think about using these metrics as in the context of warning indicators or policy monitoring or policy assessment or informing policy design, which is where I think they're more appropriate than a policy objective, part of that process is going to have to be explaining the scales to the public, explaining what's a meaningful change. And you said, you know, if we report, oh, annual life satisfaction, and average annual life satisfaction in the United States went up by, you know, from 6 to 7.2 last year. Scholars know that's a really big change over a lot of, you know, a lot of people's happiness needs to change to make that movement. But the average Joe reading that wouldn't know if it was good or bad or nothing, you know, just no familiarity with the scale. So far to go before talking about progress indicators and everything else. So we're on the same page, maybe coming from different perspectives. And then to your question about predicting things, I think it's totally viable with all the right caveats, which you've discussed. Comparing, you know, reported happiness to stated preferences, and understanding why they may be different, and that they may reflect intertemporal trade-offs and other things. Again, I think that's a really useful exercise. And then vignettes have shown to be very useful in taking things out. Like a student of Richard Eastman's just wrote a great paper where she looked at the worldwide gap in happiness across genders, where women always seem happier than men, unless they're in discriminated against places. But with vignettes, she found a sort of downward expectation bias among women, and then was able to correct the overall data for that, and found something I've also found, but it was very nicely done, that the gaps where women are happier than men are mainly rich countries, where, you know, their lives are comparable, you know, in terms of rights and everything else, and freedoms, and that to the extent there was a gap in poor countries, it was very much driven by sort of a low expectations bias, and that was through vignettes, you know. So there are all kinds of ways to get around some of the problems. And then just the last point, Dan, again, I'm left thinking a lot about the overtime dimension. So I feel like life evaluation questions get at the intertemporal nature of at least subjective well-being decently, not perfectly. Most people, when asked about how satisfied they are with their lives as a whole, do reflect on either where they're going or where they've been, depending on where they are in the age distribution. Not perfectly, but I think it captures that. Versus, I think you've raised a good challenge to the hedonic metrics, but I don't think the hedonic metrics are designed to capture the overtime emotional experience. They're designed to be daily measures. I mean, specifically, that's how they were researched and designed. But I really take your point and have been left thinking a lot about how we deal with this other question about emotional change or stability over time, and better measures for getting at that. So that's an open door for, you know, learning more and challenging more. But it really made me think a lot.
So Dan, you have on your table both the question from Mark and questions you can direct at others, or reflections.
Okay. I guess I'll start with the 1970 Clean Air Act.
Okay.
That's where so much important things started.
Yes.
Yeah.
All goes back to that.
Yeah.
So one mandate of the 1970 Act was to reduce sulfur oxide emissions from coal-fired power plants. And one provision was by 1977, Congress will have enacted some policy to reduce emissions considerably. So there was a scramble to put something there. The act that was passed in 1977 required all new coal-fired power plants in the U.S. to be built with what's called scrubbers, which is a huge reaction chamber that captures sulfur and extrudes it. And they're very, very expensive. The subsequent years showed that reductions in sulfur emissions were disappointing. I mean, there were reductions, but they weren't commensurate with costs and so forth. And the reason was not an accident. The reason that the act required scrubbers, why would the act require scrubbers? Why wouldn't they say, look, power plant industry, you figure out this is the standard. You get there. You figure out how to get there. Why is Congress figuring out how they're going to get there with scrubbers? The reason is that the committee that put together the final language of the act was headed by a couple of members of Congress from northeastern coal states. Something to know about all coal is that it's not created equal. So coal from the northeast is very high in sulfur content. It's very cheap and easy to mine and transport. Coal from the western states is much lower in sulfur content already, but is much more expensive. At that time, it was much more expensive to mine and to transport. By requiring scrubber technology, this was in effect a massive subsidy, a massive rent for the eastern coal industry. The act, for instance, explicitly excluded reducing emissions by switching fuel sources. That's business as usual, so I think you can count me among the public mind that worries about the dynamics of public choice and how they interact with policies which look angelic on their face, and we won't know until later exactly who is being served. One thing that I would say about trade-offs, I like the idea of trying to gather more information about trade-offs. But trade-offs, like preferences, aren't static. So, I mean, you know the problems with stated preferences, you know the problems with revealed preferences and so forth, but there's a sense in which there's not a fact of the matter what people's preferences are. In 1977, I mean, did Americans have a preference for computers in their homes? They certainly didn't think they did. Their buying practices for the next, 30 years wouldn't suggest that they, 20 to 30 years wouldn't have suggested that they did. But it turns out that they did. And I think a lot of preferences are like that. I mean, that's why entrepreneurship is, we talk about it's a high reward, but it's only a high reward if there's any reward, and there's a very, very low chance of there being any reward at all. And that's precisely because if there were a way to know what people's preferences were and people's trade-offs were, there's an industry that has everything to gain monetarily by figuring out what it is. And it's the dynamism. Things change. There are new ways. Why do people now not do what Keynes thought they would be doing by now, which is working 2 days a week and just living otherwise like John Maynard Keynes? One answer is, I don't know, 80 years later, there's a lot more to do with money. So, I mean, the value of money is greater than it was 80 years ago. For yourself, for your kids, for all kinds of things that are possible. Now, I mean, that's not to say everybody who makes that choice is making it because it makes sense, but it is to say that it's possible for that choice to make sense. Things never stay the same. I guess as for myself, one thing I wish I'd said more about was I should unpack a bit this phrase that I kept using, happiness as a whole, or happiness of one's life as a whole, or the rest of happiness. And we think, well, I mean, can we get at that by saying, well, look, if these 5 states of mind aren't enough, what if we have 6? Well, that's better, but it's still states of mind. So there's more to happiness than that. So one way that I try to get across to students actually early in the semester what I mean, one way of talking about happiness, and I bring it up because I want to suggest to them that this is, even though it's not the most familiar way to talk of happiness, it's one that they already have. And so I talk about one of the stories, one of you heard this already today, so I apologize, but I talk about one of the young people that was filmed in the film 7 Up, which was filmed in the early 1960s. They did is they gathered a group of very, very different children, and they interviewed them to see what their hopes were, what they were like, what their background was, get some sense of their personalities. And then they would follow up with these children every 7 years for the rest of their lives, or as long as this thing could go on, to see how their lives were unfolding. Now, what they wanted to do in the beginning was they wanted to see how strong a predictor is your 7-year-old personality of your personality for the rest of your life. But some other very interesting things, more interesting things, I think, happened. So there was one person in particular that I've been really interested with in that series, and in 1962 or 3 or whatever it was. He was 7 years old, and he was just hell on earth, this little boy. And he said he wanted to be a jockey when he grows up. Okay, fireman, policeman, athlete, jockey, okay. Well, skip ahead to 14, and now you meet this young man again, and he is working as an apprentice at a stable. And in fact, the interview with him, he's at the stable because he's busy, and he's taking care of horses, and he's learning the trade, and he's learning the trade from one end to the other, is what he's doing with his life. You skip ahead to 21, and now there's this adult, there's this young man sitting there, and he has photographs and says, here's me at my first race, and here's me at my second race. And my dad took this one of me at my third race. And my third race was my last race because I'm not a good jockey. And here he is at 21, and he's thinking, I got to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life now. I had the whole thing planned. I put all the eggs in one basket. Here I am. And it's over. And I have to start again. And it's devastating to watch. And so I remember when I watched this, I was living in a little tiny town where there was nothing to do, but there was a really good video store. And so I was renting these videos. Very quaint, I know, but I was renting them. So I thought, I have to, like before work tomorrow, I have to get to the store and like pick that thing up, And I'll come home with my lunch, whatever. And so I just have to see what happens at 28 and what's going to happen at 35. And I think about myself, so what was it that I wanted to see when I tuned in at 28? Well, I think the most natural thing to say is I wanted to see if that guy was going to be happy or not. Now, does that mean that I wanted to tune in and say, well, on the day they filmed him, was he going to feel good? Was he going to be in a good mood on that? I don't care. Who cares about that day besides him? What state of mind was I wanting to see him in? Well, plenty, but that wasn't really all I wanted to see when I said I wanted to see him happy. It wasn't even the most important thing I wanted to see when I wanted to see him happy. I wanted to see what is he doing with his life. That's his question at 21. He's got an opportunity to live his life. He wants a happy life, but he doesn't know what to do with it. What has he found to do with it? What activities are important to him? What people is he involved with? How does he spend his time? Does he spend his time feeling engaged in what he's doing? I am interested in some of his states of mind. But if I was just interested in his states of mind, maybe it's enough if he's found a really good drugstore by the time 28 rolls around. That's not what I want for him. That's not what he wants from him either. So when I talk about the happiness of a life as a whole, it's the happiness that this guy is trying to figure out if he can obtain when he's 21 years old, and that the rest of us watching hope that he can obtain. And as you watch, and he's 35, and he's 42 or 49, and so on. Now, I bring this...
Does he find it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We all have this question. You're not going on until you tell us.
Tune in next week.
Oh, there's no video stores anymore.
It's on YouTube. There is YouTube. Yeah. You can just see him at 56 and be done with it. Which I haven't done.
At least he lived till then, maybe.
I guess. Actually, I haven't seen 56. So
Okay.
I don't know.
Because it's still depressing?
No, because I wasn't living in that town anymore. I had other things to do.
Isn't this the bell curve? He should be on the way up now. On the U, I mean.
I bring this up, for a number of reasons. One is to unpack, that when I was referring to that, what do I take myself to be referring to? I think, greater finessing the notion of subjective well-being is just that, and it's valuable for what it is, but it's not ultimately this other thing that we're also interested in. That's the elusive thing that I think is fascinating. I also bring it up because it's important to avoid confusion. I read a lot of papers when they say, going back to Aristotle, the most important thing in life is happiness. And that's why I study pleasure.
Wait.
Okay, so, these are actually completely different things that people are talking about. So, we don't need more of that confusion. And the third is, I think that that confusion actually has teeth, because this is a dimension of people's well-being that actually matters quite a bit. And if we don't realize that it's very different, actually, from what we talk about in other sorts of contexts, we might not end up talking about it.
So, I think the floor's open. Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with something that you just said, Dan. It's sort of like a naive question, but the way that you were just talking about happiness, you were sort of suggesting that whatever it is, it's got to consist in something more than some collection of mental states. But I feel like it's got to be some collection of mental states. I'm not sure like which mental states exactly compose the collection that constitutes happiness, but I'm having a hard time seeing how it could be anything other than a collection of mental states. So it's not just like pleasure, but like maybe there's some attitudes in there. Maybe you got to believe that what you're doing has meaning, that you're fulfilling some sort of. That's fine, but then we're still talking about mental states. So can you just clarify what you meant by suggestion that there's more to happiness than mental
Yeah, I
states?
don't know if we're talking past each other. I mean,
Okay.
if our concept, one of the things that we talk about in English when we talk about happiness couldn't possibly be anything but a mental state. I mean, that's the category that it's in.
Yeah.
We want to analyze what that mental state is. But I think we also talk about happiness in other ways. We can talk about happiness as what state of mind you're in as you go about doing the things you're doing, living your life. We can also talk about happiness as what you're doing in your life. The fact that the things that you do are interesting and important, that they, not important to somebody else, but that they matter to you. The fact that you get to live your life that way. Now
That
that's
stuff like
consistent.
makes you happy.
It,
But it's
it
not like
brings you into
what
that state.
happiness
Okay,
is.
now we are talking past each
Okay,
other. I think.
yeah.
I mean, I can't identify what you're doing in your life with how you feel about what you're doing in your life. So if we mean by happiness how I feel about what I'm doing, then of course it's a mental state. We need another word. Well, actually, I don't think we should give up the word. I mean, when we say to newlyweds, we wish you every happiness in your life together. Do we wish them a mental state? Well, of course, but regardless of what they're doing in their lives. I mean, I think we're actually wishing for them, we hope there's a future that goes for you a particular way. Or, we wish your child every happiness, when a child is being christened or, at a birth or an older child with bar mitzvah or something like that. I think we don't, however life happens to turn out, I hope the little guy doesn't feel too bad. I think what we mean by happiness there is I hope things turn out well. Now part of that is going to be, it won't be lost on that child that things have turned out well. And they will experience that subjectively as things going well. But I think that is a way of talking about happiness too. We're very interested in what happens in this life and how things go. Think of living a life as an opportunity. And what is it to make really good use of that opportunity in a way that's going to be good for you?
Can I suggest
Please.
an example on a particular form of subjective well-being, which is satisfaction? So people can be satisfied in two ways, or can become satisfied in two ways. One is by getting what they want, or doing what they want in life, and the other is by changing their satisfaction scale so that they become more satisfied with the same thing. And that's two ways. So you can. And I don't want to say that the second way is totally without any value. It's actually good to learn to be satisfied with little things because that's good for your mental health. So it has a lot of good consequences. But it would be very strange to say that this is the only thing that counts, to be in the mental state of being satisfied without considering at all the other thing, which is, doing what you want and getting what you want.
Or
I guess
giving,
that's what you
or
are
giving
trying
what
to-
you want,
Hmm?
or giving what you want too. I mean, I think it's part of it is not getting what you want, but giving what.
Including getting the possibility to give.
Okay, there you go.
Of course, yeah. Getting the functionings that you want, and that
okay,
can be
that's
as generous as you want. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so let me mention one thing about the title of the workshop. It was both happiness and well-being. And one reason well-being was on there was to try to capture the possibility of thinking intelligibly of someone for all her psychological states. Given the way the world really is, she's not doing well. My favorite example of that is people who believe they're respected and surrounded by friends, and they're the butt of those people's jokes. And you might say, well, that makes no difference to her psychological states, but it certainly is not a life gone well. Now, that's sort of respecting, that's not happiness, but it's registering a part of something mattering to a life besides how they take it. And then if we say, but let's just focus on happiness, there may still be room to say, well, let's limit happiness to a specification of the grounds of the feeling, restricting it in various ways. And I think that's part of the upshot of saying, there was this, it's not Saturday Night Live, but this other comedy late night show where they had a dating, there's a dating company called Lowered Expectations. It's for those people who'd worked through all the other possibilities and now they just wanted a date. And you kind of want to say, so now you're getting what you want, but it's only because what you wanted is now anything. And you'd say, well, in a sense, whatever the psychological state there is, it's not the happiness, even though it depends on something psychological. Anyway. Ian.
I wanted to ask a question about something that came up a couple times. So there was a worry about the methodology of some of these surveys that you want to be careful to avoid framing effects. And one of the examples was, you don't first ask somebody how their marriage is going and then ask them, But I was thinking, I can imagine cases where it goes both ways, right? So there could be a case in which, someone's in a bad mood, but then you ask them to reflect on their marriage and they're like, actually, yeah, everything's going pretty well. So, that kind of corrects for an error. Of course, I can imagine cases in which, you had a fight with your spouse the night before and you ask about the marriage and then, that creates a bias. But it doesn't seem to me that just framing things in different ways necessarily has this kind of distorting effect. Sometimes it could have a kind of clarifying effect. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
I think it depends on what your objective is in asking the question and in collecting the data. So if you wanted to know more about the association between marriage and life satisfaction, that would potentially be a one way to get at it, maybe. But the issue with framing effects is one reason I think that these questions work so well around the world, different cultures, different countries, different people, in some very consistent patterns, is that by asking a question like, how satisfied are you with your life in general, you already have a translation problem, but I think we've been pretty good at doing that. But other than that, you are not imposing any definition on what life satisfaction is, or if you use the happiness question, whatever. Even you ask meaning or purpose, you're not imposing a definition of what those things are. If you, versus, there may be very different cultural norms about marriage or something else that you frame the question with. It would then, it would push the definition of life satisfaction or contentment, whatever you want, whatever well-being question you want to ask, in that direction. And that might work well if you have a kind of homogeneous sample. One country's cultural norms are very similar. It might. I'm still a little worried about it because I think it's distorting. But trying to compare across people, you have cultures where, this finding on women, where marriage is an imposed norm. And we find, for example, not asking explicitly about marriage, but just looking at the life satisfaction of married people, that there is no positive marriage association the way there is in countries where marriage is not an imposed norm. And that's particularly so for women. So I think you can see where I'm going with this. It's, and say you just do it with, your job or whatever. Well, Americans work all the time. And so myself included, even though I'm from Peru, and so my job, so yes, what I do with my life professionally is a huge part of my life, and I'm very lucky I happen to love it, and that probably makes me do more of it, and whatever it might be. Having 3 kids in college doesn't help either, but no, but more seriously. But there are other cultures where, and there are also even there's many other parts of our economy where people's jobs are just crap. They go, they click the top, they may have a hard work ethic, but it's not because jobs are fun. It's not because they encourage creativity. They encourage obeying the rules and just, doing it, right? So even then, say a question about job satisfaction prior to life evaluations would bias things in a way, so if you have a life where your job is a function but it's not a source of meaning, purpose, or anything else, people will likely emphasize that less as they think about their lives as a whole, right? If they're thinking about what they're satisfied with. So I think that's why, in general, we really worry about framing effects, because you never know exactly which way they'll play out. Versus if it's a straight open-ended question, it's in the person to sort of, speaking of this happiness as a whole concept, to define that concept for him, his or herself.
One thing I could perhaps add is that one danger with framing effects is when the design of the questionnaire changes and you don't control that, and then you can have gaps in the curve and you don't understand where they come from. So you have to go back to what happened to the questionnaire in order to understand the source of this. But you were totally right that sometimes asking questions before can help. I think there is an example of that also with respect to weather. So there was a study that showed that if you didn't ask about weather, there was an effect of weather on the subjective well-being. But if you did make people reflect on the weather before answering, then the effect of weather disappeared. So it can go either way, and there is, I guess there are at least 2 things. One is mood effect, so perhaps the weather thing was a mood effect, and the other is a focusing effect. Right? So that's the issue of if you ask questions about particular domains and just a subset of particular domains, then people will tend to think of these and forget the others. I must confess, I'm a bit torn about the idea that it's good to have questions which are very short and vague, because it allows for a lot of noise in interpretation of the question, and people can fill them in various ways. So I think we should explore the other extreme, which is to really have thorough questions where somehow you control all the domains that people have to think about, but try to make that as exhaustive as possible without being normative, right? So being purely neutral, but at least make sure that people think about all these things. Perhaps that would reduce a little bit some of the noise. I wouldn't be against trying that.
Yeah, that's good, if I can. I mean, the problem that you're after, I think, is, I'm stepping out a bit, but the problem that you're after is, but I mean, it might be good to prompt people to think in one direction rather than another. And you're right, but instead of using framing effects and hoping that they get it right, which I do think is a dangerous thing, there is this effect where you can flag this to people. Okay, I'm not asking you about the weather, I'm not asking, don't just focus on the match last week, that kind of thing. And then the results actually do get better, you get more reliable sorts of surveys. There was something else, but I'll let it go.
Dan?
Thank you. Change the topic a little bit to follow up on the question from Carol's that I had from Carol's presentation about the slide with the U curve. A couple of questions. One of them is just a response from my own study of CDC data. I was fortunate enough to have access and was doing some work looking at suicide rates. And in 2015, suicide was among the top 10 causes of death in the United States. And what was really striking me in my survey of the data was that it seemed that clusters of suicides didn't seem to correlate with depression in particular. And so, or socioeconomic conditions. in the region where they occurred. And so I thought that that observation put some pressures on the possibility that looking at stress levels of people in the population might help us to see whether there would be one of these deaths that you were concerned about. That was one sort of question for the whole panel to talk about. But the other thing was, and I think you sort of mentioned this in passing, but you know, there's a danger that seeing that you get a decline, sort of bottoms out around the 40s, or 50s, I think, or 50s. I mean, if people who, let's say, does have something to do with being unhappy, the suicide and unhappiness do correlate, that if it is a large chunk of people in the population, and 10, you know, being in the top 10 causes of death in the country is a pretty big chunk of people. I forgot the exact number off the top of my head. It's been a couple of weeks since I've seen the data, but that would seem to take out a significant chunk of people, and so that, you know, the number of suicides might be relevant to the upswing in happiness later in life, and it's also, if you're looking at social level data, you know, to make any inferences about our psychology changing over time doesn't seem warranted at all, right? I mean, like, if we're going to get happier in their 50s and 60s, it doesn't seem to, because I thought that suggestion was maybe misunderstood.
Okay, let me answer the latter question first, because it's, even though, yeah, it's cross-section data, but it's been done in lots of other different ways. Over time, with the same cohort, testing for cohort effects, whatever. So the age curve seems to hold, and in even with raw uncorrected data. So
you follow the same individuals longitudinally?
Yeah, there's been some studies that do that as well, for sure. But other even cross-section studies which will control for cohort effects, you know, so when the ages people were born, the sort of block of years cohorts were born. But yeah, there's also selection bias in that curve, because not just suicide, but happier people live longer, right? I mean, so there's all kinds of other causes of death that are occurring, and you know, it's just, there may be a happy to be alive effect. I don't know. I mean, but it's pretty remarkable. But it's a really well put question. There's been a huge debate on this age curve, and it's really, I would say, the balance of the evidence just suggests that it's not cohort effects. It's not, you know. To the suicide clusters, I'm not sure I got your question right. I just got the 2015-2016 data, so I haven't. But I'd already read that the age band of premature deaths has widened over time, and we even used 35 to 64-year-olds in the analysis that I showed, so we widened the age band as well, and that possibly the locational band had also widened. Not so much that there still is a big difference in suicide rates across whites versus minorities. That seems to still hold. But you said by suicide clusters, and then something about understanding stress. So you're saying that there's suicide clusters outside the regions where you think this would be the highest, right? Or outside the age groups? I wasn't sure what you meant with that. And then what the question about the association with stress was. I just didn't quite get the exact phrasing.
One factor that I've looked at is on depression levels in the population. So I guess I'm wondering to what extent that might be related to stress levels. And so, but it looks like the depression levels don't give a clear signal for suicide. And it looks like actually, from some work I've seen, that what does seem to be the strongest correlation is ease of access to reliable means of painlessly killing yourself. So if you have easy access to handguns in the U.S., pesticides in China, and it was sticking your head in coal-fired ovens in Victorian England. And there's interesting, very strong correlations of price sensitivity to the price of these things and suicide rates, which correlates very strongly.
Yeah, I've done a little work on the sort of progress paradox and suicide rates in China, which is pretty remarkable. But yeah, because that's a great question. We've looked at depression. We find reported, not clinical depression, to be higher among, the same uneducated white cohorts than it is among minorities and wealthier cohorts. Not as huge as the white minority difference. And I think, as far as I can tell, that stress, and you probably know much more about this than I do, but as far as I can tell from the data, stress and worry track very closely together. And they both seem to be correlated with premature suicide rate or premature mortality rate. And depression is kind of different. One of the things I've found I've done some looking at things like the financial crisis and these well-being metrics. And so most of the metrics change a lot. You'll see with the onset of the financial crisis, life satisfaction plummeted, stress went way up, all these things. Depression was just flat. It was like if you were already depressed, you didn't even react. So I think there is the sort of, the others are more volatile, and depression seems to... Yes. Yeah, right. But this speaks to your point. I'm not sure depression is the predictor, because there's a certain sort of nothingness about depression where people just don't do anything. I'm sure there's some depressed people that commit suicide, but it doesn't seem to be the driver as much as these swings in emotions. That's one thing. The other thing about your point about the ease of access, I think, is hugely important. So, for example, I think that's why women may be more likely to say they want to kill themselves and then they don't actually do it, and men are more likely to pull a trigger. But there's also differences across the country. Here I used to work on happiness. I'm talking about all this, but across the country, the way people commit suicide is very different. So in the Southwest, it's much more likely to be violent firearms death. In other places, I think it's New England, some of Appalachia, it's much more likely to be drug overdoses. So intentional or not, suicide, I mean, pretty close. In other places, it could be taking pills. So, yeah, and obviously the fact that we can buy guns more easily than candy here is not helping on that front in terms of ease of access. So, all good points. Maybe the one thing I feel like I can say most definitively is this issue of the emotions that can change more, stress, anger, and worry, and that depression seems to be just a more stable, non-action, not always, but in general, kind of a non-active state.
So, Mike, oh, yes.
My work here at Carolina revolves largely around student well-being, and my particular interest in that really is around issues of health equity and inclusion and access, and particularly sort of how underrepresented students, minority students, when they're on the white campus, might experience issues of welcoming and success and access and satisfaction, happiness. Again, I'll mix all those terms there. Have either of you done much work looking at issues of oppression or access as it relates to happiness? And then I think about our current national condition, where we have a lot of issues of expressed racism, oppression, other isms related to that, and what the cumulative effect might be on those populations that are being pinpointed as results to well-being.
So it's a really tough question. I mean, you have, just on the aggregate, populations that have been traditionally discriminated against being the most resilient, the most optimistic, have been making gradual progress. One thing I thought might make a big difference is this change, and yet some of the things I've been seeing in the data, I still need to do the whole year of 2017 because it has things that played out. So there was right after the election, there was a huge drop in life satisfaction for Democrats and independents. It was as large as the drop in life satisfaction at the time of the financial crisis. But then it slowly recovered. Now, I don't have post-inauguration data yet from Gallup. I'll get it I should get it soon, actually, for the first half of because in a way it's been worse than even the expectations of it were. But on the other hand, you've seen people be active and mobilize and sort of wake up. And that's actually, so apparently so anger and hope together are apparently a good thing. Anger and no hope are a bad thing. So it's, I'm sure there are well-being effects and lots of effects on all kinds of people, and surely it's I mean, you see what's going on in terms of, making racism, sort of trying to normalize it again, and all these other things that have, I think, potentially quite large effects on reported well-being, and at the same time, the sort of the collective sort of sense of having to mobilize against it may counterbalance that.
Bonnie?
Yeah, thanks. So I had a question for Carol. So one theme that seemed to be kind of prevalent in the other talks was this worry that, the indicators that we're using to measure, happiness or well-being have these various problems with them. And so, we have to be sort of cognizant of how can we do better? How can we avoid getting tricked by these indicators? But it seemed like one thing that I heard you saying a lot in your talk was, the function of these indicators was kind of to draw our attention to maybe a pattern that we didn't expect, or to draw our attention to the fact that something was changing that maybe we wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And so I guess I'm curious whether, as someone who's sort of steeped in the practice of this, you have a feeling that maybe it's less important to have indicators that get things conceptually right than it is to have lots of indicators that can alert us to patterns, and then we just have to go figure out what's actually going on. Is that a fair way to sort of parse your approach to these
Yeah, it's
things?
a good question. Well, I think in this area, because there's a lot of noise and different psychological differences across respondents and everything else, that I personally like the simpler, most open-ended, questions that people can't misinterpret, that aren't framed for them, that aren't, and the patterns in those seem to be very consistent. And in the end, if we're just trying to, my objectives with this stuff is fairly modest, which is to try and put, human psychology back into the economics equation, and also, even when I talk about warning indicators, saying, okay, if you see a huge change of mood in a large cohort in a very negative direction, we should find out more about that. So I think it's a lot of very refined indicators hinged to specific questions, I think could be really interesting for different lines of academic work, and that's totally fine. Right. But I think if we're going to talk about indicators that we can begin to think of including in the kind of statistical data we already collect, and in a way that's feasible, both in terms of ease of collecting and feeling that they're robust questions, and then also ease of analytics and disseminating them to the public, I think, again, simpler is better. So there may just be two different sets of things you can do with this approach and the data.
Cool, thanks.
We are at the end of this session, which means we have a reception when more questions can be asked and some more eating can be done. I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking our three speakers.